Hello everyone and welcome to Methods Week 2. This week we are going to look at your patterns and we are going to start to manipulate them, duplicate them, replicate them, twist them and turn them and make them 10 times more complex than they are right now. Okay, so let's get started. So I have created a new pattern to use this week. You can see right here. Move my layers into the corner. I have a pattern and a 9-square grid on the basis that we started with last week. One thing to notice when you're working in the model space, you can tell I'm working in the top view. If you go up to the little arrow, similar to what we did last time, if you go all the way down here, you can do Print Preview, which actually lets you see your line weights and your line types while you are in the workspace, as opposed to just when you are on your presentation board. Okay? So that's a nice thing to look at if you ever want to see that. I'm going to go back to the shaded view, maybe, and I'm going to untoggle the print preview. So what we have here is our view, and I have all these different lines. And what I want to look at is actually taking this 9-square, 9-inch by 9-inch grid and actually making it a bigger grid and making it more complex by increasing the size of it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to actually look at just seeing the different ways I could replicate this grid without actually changing it. So what I don't want to have to do is grab each and every single line or collect everything and move it over and realize I've forgotten a line. So what I can do is I can actually use my arrow and select everything in my grid by going left to right. And then what I can do is I can group all of this, and I can use the group command. I can either type group. I can also use, I'm just going to undo that really quick. I can do Control G, which groups it, or the button right over here with this little pile of circles is also group. Okay, so 3 ways to do the same command. So once I have that grouped, you'll see if I use my gumball, I can actually move this around all I want as a whole group, and that is really handy for replicating things. You'll find that really useful throughout modeling. So now that I have this grouped, let's look at what happens if I just take my one grid and then turn it into actually that being one corner of a 9-square grid. So the easiest thing to do is to use my copy command. So I use copy over here, and I'm just going to copy from corner to corner to corner. Now I have 3 going across, and then I can select all 3 of those. I'm going to copy it up, corner, click on the corner. So I've got my snaps and my grid on up here, and now I have same pattern. Let's look at the print preview. It's more fun. Much more complex, much more information. The repetition starts to feel more repeated, and you start to see the patterns and the lines more thoroughly just by duplicating that. All right? So that's the easiest way to take your grid and make it a more complex grid. So that's just by copying each of the views. Okay? Okay, so that's the easiest way to create a more complex grid, is to just make more of it and duplicate it. So the next thing we can do is we can actually, I'm going to come in and I'm going to delete these 6 over here. I'm just clicking and deleting. Now I'm going to use, what I'd like to do is actually take this and flip it and mirror it along this edge. So instead of it being copied, it's mirrored. So I can use the command with an easy name. It's mirror. I type it, mirror. Okay. So I'm going to select the objects I want to mirror right here. Hit enter. And then now it's asking me up here, it's important to look at your command line. It wants the start of the mirror plane. So what we're going to do is right now, it wants you to tell it what is the line along which it wants to be mirrored. So first I'm going to select the top here. And then by default, if I have my ortho on, it's going to choose that vertical line. So now I have a pattern that's actually mirrored down the center. Okay, so that's one way to mirror. That's the orthographic way to mirror. Now I could have also taken the same thing, hit mirror again, and I could have mirrored this way. I can keep doing this. Until I have a really big and complicated pattern. Okay, so that's mirroring. That's mirroring in orthographic. But let's see what happens when we decide. I'm going to go back to my 3. What if we want to mirror it not down the vertical? So let's try mirror. Select my objects to mirror. Hit enter. And then here I'm going to click, and I'm actually going to mirror it to right there. So then I start to get a pattern, you know. You can start to see some stuff happening here. Maybe I want to do that again. See what happens. Maybe I'm actually going to group these 3 now that I know how to group, and let's mirror it again. Let's see, I want to mirror it that way. So we start to get these like really intense patterning. So that is one way to start mirroring. Let's try to do something that seems a little more organized. Maybe if we mirror on a 45, let's see what happens. We just take one of these. If we mirror it on a 45, it matches what we did. That starts to be kind of interesting. So you can see when you mirror also, it's duplicating what you have. And you can see it's duplicating it here because it's asking you for a copy. So I do that. Okay. Right, so you can see we can start to take this really organized grid and create a little bit of reorganized chaos by playing with the mirror command. If you wanted to do something where you actually just mirrored it and you got rid of the original, you can click on mirror, click on your object, do mirror, and then instead of copy yes, you could have copy no. And then you can see they'll take that object and just start to overlap it over here. All right, so depending on whether you overlap things at the same angle or you choose a different angle, you'll start to get different patterns within your patterns, which are patterns you didn't create, but you created by overlapping multiple patterns at differing angles. So I think that's sort of an interesting way to start to create a more complex, more interesting pattern from your pattern. And the thing that you can do is you could come in here and you can take your group, you can ungroup it, and you can start to manipulate parts of it if you don't want as many things there, right? You can start to delete elements, perhaps of different parts of your pattern to simplify it, okay? So that is mirroring. Okay, so going back to the original grid, now we are going to look at rotating. So there's 2 different ways that we can rotate. The first way to rotate is to select your object, and then you can see there's a rotate tool right here. Rotate to 2D is what we're going to use. And if we select that, the important thing that they're asking for here is the center of rotation. So let's look at what happens depending on where we choose the center of rotation. So if I click the center of rotation right here in the center of my grid, it's going to start to create a circle. If I just click in the center and then I drag away, it's going to ask me for the angle or the first reference point. So let's just click out here. And then it's going to ask me for the second reference point. So you can see I could do this manually. And here I have my ortho on, so it's bouncing at 90 degrees. If I unclick my ortho, I can start to rotate this any amount I want, or I can put a number in. So I'm going to put in 30. And then the last thing we want to look at here is just like with the mirror, it's asking whether we want to make a copy or not. And I want to make a copy. So I'm going to toggle this so it says yes. So 30 and yes. Hit enter. And now I have this and it's rotated around the center here, right? So if I keep doing that, let me do it one more time. Same rotation, I'm going to do another 30 degrees. So I drag my mouse out here, I click, I type in 30, and I hit enter. So now I have actually this really interesting centrally organized pattern just by taking that grid and rotating it twice on a 30-degree angle. Now you could use any angle. I use 30 because I know that 30, 30, 30 equals 90, and that it would come back together and create a circle, right? So that's one way to rotate. So let's look at, and that's choosing the center. So let's look at what happens if we use a different point. So if I click on here and I choose my rotation here, let's start in a corner. And then I'm going to turn my ortho back on. I'm going to click out here. So now if I click over here, the rotation starts to look similar to with the ortho on when I was mirroring or copying, even though I'm rotating. But if I turn my ortho off and I start to do something like, let's look at 30 degrees here. Now I start to get something similar. So let's do this a few more times. Rotate 30. Rotate 30. So now I start to have this like intertwining, a little bit of a mess, but it's an intertwining organization there. Maybe as I zoom out, it looks pretty messy. When I start to zoom in, it looks different. But I could always come in and start to find patterns within these patterns, right? Then I could also take this whole thing and I could mirror it. So here I had cut my copy off. Let's put my copy back on. We'll do it again. Mirror. And now I get this larger pattern with this sort of aberration. Maybe I don't like the way this looks, but I like the rotation. And maybe I want to take this rotation and actually set it so it's sitting within the pattern. So I come up here, maybe I slide this up to that corner, do the same thing down here. Right? Now I start to get some really funky things happening, but all within this grid, right? So those are two ways to rotate. So let's look at a different way to rotate. And here we're going to look at polar arrays. Okay? So if I want to rotate this, and I know that I want to rotate this, say, 8 times around a circle, instead of doing rotate, 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 I can use what's called an array, which will actually do all the math for you and set it up the way you want it. So here I'm going to type in array. And when you type in array, you'll see there's a whole bunch of different arrays. And we'll look at a couple of these, but right now we're using polar. Polar meaning polar coordinates, so polar around a circle. So let's click here. And again, just like with the rotation, it wants the center point. So I'm actually going to pick right here. I'm going to pick the center of that diamond. And then it asks me how many objects. So we're just going to go with 8. And then it's going to ask me what angle to fill out. It starts with 90, but let's do 360 because 360 is a full circle. Look at that. So now it's giving you a preview of what you would get out of that array. So say I decided I didn't like that and I want to change it to more pieces. So I could change my items to 16, right? Then I start to get this way more complex view. Or I could change it to 4. 4 puts it back into a box. So, or 12, right? So what's great about the polar array is that it does, like I said, it does all the math for you. It figures out all the angles. It makes sure everything is evenly dispersed, right? And it rotates it for you, right? So I'm just going to hit what up here it says hit enter to accept. I'm going to hit enter. And now I have, you can see my original grid is highlighted still, but now I have this sort of great pattern that is central. At this point, it's central around that one corner. So if I wanted to, here's the important thing about arrays. If you want to edit it, you still have all these individual grouped pieces. But you can see how they're all centered around that one point, right? So I could also come into this array and maybe I want to use my light lines and I want to start drawing into it. Right? So now I have a pattern with a larger pattern outside of it. So now I have this outline. Maybe I want this offset. And I want to create sort of a secondary order within that. Right? So that's polar array. So let's undo that and go back to the original. And let's try that again, but let's put the point further away from the actual grid. So let's try that. So array, polar, and I want these objects to array, but I'm going to turn my grid snap on so I know that I'm on a grid point, but let's say, I'm going to make that center point right here. Let's do the same number of items and the 360. So you can see there, same idea, but now you have this sort of interesting shape in the middle that you've created. Just from the act of doing that array, right? And so depending on what quantity and what angles you choose, I can offset this inward. You know, I could even start to create a pattern within this pattern that's separate from the other one, right? Good. But so those are my polar arrays. So there's a million different ways you can use that to manipulate your pattern. So that's rotating and polar arrays. Right? You get some really interesting complexity in here. Okay. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is scaling and reshaping your object. So scaling is taking your object and making it proportionally smaller or larger. And you can do this to single objects or you can do this to groups. We're just going to keep working in the group here. So first thing I want to do is let's look at the command scale as a basic. So scale, you just type the word. It says select your object to scale. You hit enter and then left click on a base point. Almost all of these commands have this base point, and then it's going to ask you for either a scale factor or a reference point. So if we want to just make it twice as big, we could type 2 and hit enter. Boom, the whole thing's twice as big. Right? if we wanted to do the same thing, but make it visually a little bit bigger, we could just click at our base point, left click at a reference point, and then drag the mouse until we got it as big as we wanted it to be. And so sometimes you do this because you're making it bigger to refer to another point. So that's just scale. So you can just keep making it bigger or smaller. So say we wanted to create this. Say I did a copy and place. And then what I did is I took one of the two and I did the scale, clicked the corner. Maybe I just made it 1.5 times bigger. And then you start to get this overlap of the square within the square. Say I did it again, copy and place, scale. Actually don't need to do the copy and place. I could just have done copy. I'll show you what I should have done. Objects, enter. You can turn that copy on. And I can keep going 1.5. So I start to get this overlapping object that changes scale. And I could do the opposite. Instead of making everything bigger, I could also go in and make this object here smaller. So I've been doing 1.5, but say we could do 0.75. We could do that again. So you just start to get this object. Maybe this one's a little complex to go too small over here, but you can see we get this big scale and it changes as it gets smaller and more detailed. And this would be a good time to come in and you could take, say, if I wanted to combine some of these commands, I could take that and then use the mirror command, and I could mirror that diagonally. And I start to have this complexity in more than one spot. Or I could do a polar array and select these objects in the corner, enter, pick this as my center. I think if I do 4, 360, then I start to fill my 4 corners. So you can see you can start to get a pattern that where it's got a lot more variation. Mine was very symmetrical and organized, and now with these manipulations you start to have this variation on the side. Okay, so that's just scaling things up and down with the whole scale, right? So let's undo. Let's look at some other ways we want to scale. So that's scaling everything. So let's try a scale 1D. So scale 1D, what it does, it allows you to scale an object in one direction. So let me just show you what happens. We select our object, hit enter, left click the base point. Here I'm going to click this other end as a reference point. And then I'm going to drag the mouse up so you can see that it stretches it, or conversely, if I shrink it down, it smushes it. Okay. So if I do that, we can do copy as well, leave our original there, and maybe we just stretch it twice as far. We start to get some of these overlaps. We could do that again. Starts to really distort, but then you start to get these kind of changing patterns as they go around. So that was scaling in one direction. We could take this whole thing and do a scale 1D. Click here, click here. We could squeeze the whole thing left. That was a copy. We could also take this whole thing, I'm just going to grab one side of it and mirror it. right? And then say we wanted to take this whole thing and we could scale it again. Right? So you can start to use that scaling to change and shift and distort as a group. Okay? And you don't have to use your whole group. Like I could come in here and I could ungroup this and I could scale some of these things. Like I could come in and select this diamond and do a scale 1D and just stretch it this way. Right? So that's a way to start to make different patterns, right? Because you kept that diamond and then you stretched and got a second one. And then maybe I take this and I mirror it. I turn my ortho back on. Stays. Right? So you can start to make patterns within these patterns. Okay? So I'm going to go backwards again. Too far. And then let's look at the scale 1D in a non-orthogonal chart here. And let's say we scale it to there. Now we're starting to distort the object. And maybe you actually want to start working instead, not with this, but with this distorted version. And then you can start to make different patterns with these different distortions by mirroring them. Right? So that was scale 1D. But instead of going straight on an orthographic, I chose a different angle. Could also flatten it. And then you could use something like that to create now I've got this kind of totally different pattern. Right? So that's all with scale 1D. And we won't use scale 2D here because scale 2D is more of a three-dimensional tool. So you're either scaling the whole thing or you're scaling 1D. But you can really do a lot with that command. You can really start to manipulate your space with that. Okay, the next command I want to show you is an array, but this time it's a linear array. And in this case, I'm not actually going to use this pattern. I'm going to actually just start using a line. So I'm going to take one line here, and I'm going to click on this line, and I'm going to type array, and instead of choosing polar, I'm going to choose linear. So in this case, let's look at the number of items. Let's say we've got 10, and here we've got a first reference point. And then now I'm not doing anything, but see how it starts to take these lines and distribute them evenly next to my object, right? So that's the linear array. So let's do that again. Let's see what else we can do with this. Okay, select this. Say I want 20 items this time. And here's my first reference point. I'm going to turn off my snaps so I can have a little more variation. But you can see here we can start to add lines in between lines so they can be much closer together. So you can start to have different patterns within that. You can also, if I take a line, I'm going to draw a line this way. You can also use that linear array go vertically. So same thing, we're going to do 20. I'm going to start here, but then this time I'm going to drag that line upwards. So we start to get this rectangular grid. Then once we have that, we can start to manipulate these things in different ways. We can start to do the same commands. We can polar array that. Right? We start to take these lines. So you can do this combination of linear arrays and polar arrays. So if you have more of a line type drawing, you can do that. In this case, I probably should have grouped them. See what happens. Let's see if I want to create something that's got more of a gradient effect. Okay, so maybe I'd have this spacing where I'm at 1, and then let's use the so say we've got 20 items and we want them to go only halfway. Say we've got 5 items and we want them to be super dense and close here on the end. So we start to have different patterns. So then we can copy these lines individually. We can move them around. So we can start to get a gradient. And then let's take this thing, make it a group. And then now that you have this gradient line, you can stretch it. Right? So the gumball is actually a version of the scale 1D. We could array this whole object linearly. So let's say we want 5 objects. Look here. And then we can start to extend those. So you start to get that repetition. And then maybe you want that whole thing stretched. Right? You start to get these linear patterns. Right? Maybe you want them closer together. So you can array a single thing or you can array multiples. Right? So we're using lines, but we could do the same thing if we had a rectangle. We could do linear array. Click on that. Say we do 5 items, first reference point, and it'll stretch them out over the space. Okay. Okay, the other version of an array that we're going to look at is the rectangular array. So I'm going to click on the square here, and you can see rectangular array is over here. It's a little grid. I click on that. It's going to ask me for a number of objects in the x direction. I'm going to say 10. Number in the y direction, 10. Number in the z direction, keep that at 1 because we're working 2-dimensionally. And then it's going to ask for unit cell or x spacing. So let's just click here in the corner for a base point. And then you can see as we drag the mouse out, we get this grid of squares. They can be even, they can be uneven. And here's the important step. So if I find it and I put it here, click, and then it's going to show me before I finish the x spacing here and the y spacing here. So in this case, the x is way longer than the y, but say I change my x spacing to 5. Now it's all even. I can change my y spacing to 10. Now it's uneven, and then when I'm happy with it, I hit enter. All right? So that works with anything. So let's see what happens when we use our pattern. I'm going to make a copy of it and move it over here so I have more space. So let's do the same thing. Rectangular array, 10 in the x direction, 10 again in the Y direction, 1 in the Z direction, click in the corner, and then as you start to drag away, it'll start to duplicate your grid. So you could start with just clicking on this corner and see what it would do. Here your X spacing is 9 and your Y spacing is 9. That makes sense because you had a 9 square grid. Watch what happens if we change that to 10 and 10. So we get a pattern where it overlaps. We could also change it to, say we changed it to 6 in one direction, so it overlapped partially, although it's sort of repetitive that way, so it just looks like the same thing. What if we changed it to 5? Then we start to get these elements that overlap, so you could change both of them to 5. And then it starts to create, you can see a different pattern forming with your pattern, right? And I'm going to hit enter. And then there we go. Now I have a totally new pattern. It honestly looks very different than the pattern I started with because I offset it in a way that the pattern repeated unexpectedly, right? So that is the rectangular array. So you can do this with lines, you can do it with shapes, you can do it with groups, you can use the arrays for any different kind of objects.